are going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about Scrum and talking about the Scrum Guide in particular. Okay, so a little bit about me. As you can see, this is me and my family. And apart from being a mother and a wife, I'm also keen on traveling. Not so much in the last year or so, but I still love it. I also am a big TV addict. I love watching TV and a food lover. And in addition, I'm an Agile and Lean coach and a professional Scrum Master, certified product owner, SAFe program consultant, and a release train engineer. So we're here to talk about the Scrum Guide. And in the year 2020, we celebrated 2 birthdays. One was the Scrum that celebrated 25 years, and the other one was the Scrum Guide that celebrated 10 years anniversary. The brief history of Scrum started in '95, where it was introduced, but it really picked up in the millennium, the first decade of the millennium, with the release of the book Agile Software Development with Scrum. Then the Scrum Alliance was formed, scrum.org, things really gained momentum. And in 2010, the Scrum Guide first edition was published. Now the guide kept on being updated throughout the years in the last 10 years. And as you can see, for example, in 2017, the 3 questions of the daily Scrum that we are all familiar with, they were added, or another update that happened was the chicken and pigs that we are connecting with Scrum. That was part of the first edition of the Scrum Guide, but it was removed already on the second version in 2011. So, but then we come to ask ourselves the question, why should we care about those changes that happen in the Scrum Guide? We are having Scrum, we read the guide, we got the training. So what are those changes? Why should we care about them? And to answer that, what we really need to ask ourselves is, are we really doing Scrum? And what does it mean to do Scrum? Because a lot of people are saying that they are doing Scrum. And according to the latest annual State of Agile report, for example, 58% of all Agile development projects are practicing Scrum. But are they really practicing Scrum? Well, if you ask coaches or people who are deeply familiar with Scrum, many of them will say that a lot of organizations are actually practicing technical Scrum, practicing methodologies of Scrum, things like having sprints, or they are defining roles, as in Scrum Master, Product Owner, Scrum teams, they're having dailies, but those are technical things, and the essence of Scrum is not always there. So what is Scrum? Scrum is, as we, if I'm quoting from the Scrum Guide using its words, well, Scrum is simple to understand and difficult to master. Well, Scrum is simple because this is a short of Scrum. Scrum is a framework based on empiricism that has 3 pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And it's designed to help us deal with complex situations, complex problems. But what does it mean? Okay, it's not simple. And a lot of cases, what we see in organizations is that unclear, or there are things that surprising things, people, then all of a sudden people start to cut corners, start to do something that we call Scrum but. Yeah, we're doing Scrum, but, and I can give an example for maybe you are all familiar with, yeah, we're doing Scrum, but we're not doing daily every day. We're having it twice a week because it just takes too much time, it's not effective, and the rest of the days the Scrum Master just talks directly with the team members individually. Or, for example, yes, we're doing Scrum, but when we have a feature that we really must ship fast, then we're giving okay for the Scrum teams not to meet the definition of done. Okay, so this is not actually doing Scrum and understanding what is behind everything that is written. So it's important from now and then to come and check yourself to see maybe there are things that you need to adjust in your processes, to see that you are following the principles of Scrum. And it's like having your health checks, your annual health checks, that you're checking if everything is okay. Even if you are not sure that there is a problem, it's good to go and do your blood test. Or you're taking your car to the garage, even if it's not broken every year, to check that everything is fine. Maybe you need to do some fine tuning. So this is why it's really important to also come and check from time to time to see that you're fine-tuned on your Scrum. So what does the Scrum guide, the new 10-year version, brings us? Well, no shock there, Scrum will remain Scrum. It's not 190 degrees change, it's just becoming leaner. And if we look at the poster of Scrum from the previous version, from 2017, this is how it was, and this is the new one. You can see there isn't much of a change. You can see two changes mainly. One with the Scrum team, that the development team is now broken into several developers, and with the increment, now the increment is pushed before the sprint review. And we'll talk about it a little bit further. So the first change that I want to talk about is called one team focused on one product. And the idea behind this change is that we will not have anymore a team within the Scrum team. Scrum has one team, the Scrum team only. So the development team that was once part of the Scrum team, it's no longer exists. Now it's called developers. And when we say developers, the meaning in the Scrum for developers is not programmers, not people who are writing code. Developers are the people who are involved in the development of the increment. So it can be mathematicians, it can be DevOps people, it can be analysts, it can be UX people. It's not just the coders, okay? Don't get confused by the wording developers. And another change that we see here is with the roles and the accountabilities. We no longer have role definitions. So the three roles that we have, the Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Dev Team, are now replaced with accountabilities. The accountability of the Product Owner, the accountability of the Scrum Master, and the accountability of the developers. And that shift changed us from talking about responsibilities into talking about accountabilities. Now, what is the difference between responsibility and accountability? Well, responsibility is a task-oriented. It's an ownership, or it's taking ownership over a task, whereas accountability is taking ownership over the results. And it's a big change. Responsibility, it can be shared, but accountability will always remain with one person. So if we're looking, for example, on the accountability of the product owner. So the product owner is accountable for having an effective backlog, product backlog management. And that accountability remains always with the product owner. But doesn't mean that the product owner is the only one writing product backlog items. That responsibility can be shared with the developers. The developers can write backlog items into the product backlog, but still the accountability, the ownership of the results from those product backlog items that the developers wrote remains with the product owner. Now, another change that we see in the new guide is something new completely. It's the introduction of the new term that is called product goal. Now, goal is something that gives us meaning to what we do. It's super important because it helps us look at the path forward. It gives us meaning. It gives us focus on where we want to go. And up until now, we only had a short-term goal, short-term vision. We talked about only the sprint goal. Now, the Scrum Guide is talking about something a bit longer, a long-term goal, which is the product goal. And the sprint goal is the steps that will take us into fulfilling our product goal. The product owner is accountable for defining a clear and understood product goal, and all the teams that are working on the product should be familiarized with it. Like I mentioned before when I talked about the Scrum is based on 3 pillars of empiricism: traceability, inspection, and adaptation. The transparency is critical if you want to improve over time, because you want to see results and you want to understand what you're seeing, and you want to talk in a common language that everyone that are involved in the project are talking about the same thing. They understand what you're saying. In order to do that, the Scrum is defining commitments. The commitments are the things that are in common, that are well understood by everyone. Until now, we had 2 commitments. We had the sprint goal that was a commitment for the sprint backlog. And we had the definition of done that was the commitment for the increment. In the new guide, since the product goal was introduced, this is the commitment for the product backlog. So now we have 3 commitments. And also the guide, now it elaborates a bit more about the previous commitments. Now it elaborates a bit more about the sprint goal, what it means, and it's talking a bit more about the definition of done and what it means. And I want to spend a minute also talking about the definition of done, because there's a lot of confusion out there between definition of done, what it means, what is the difference between definition of done and acceptance criteria. So I want to clarify that. Well, definition of done is a criteria. It's like a checklist of things, of quality measures that you need to fulfill in order to say, yeah, this product is done and ready to be released. It's an increment. Okay, and the definition of done, that is general. It's not changing between one product backlog item to another. It's the same for all of them. And in the definition of done, you can put things like unit tests, you can put 0 defects, or code review, documentation, performance test, things like that. Every measure that you're deciding to, with regards to your quality measures. The acceptance criteria is something different. Acceptance criteria are the scenarios or the use cases that your product backlog item needs to meet. It's from functionality point of view. That's why the acceptance criteria will be different between the product backlog items. Now, the definition of done should be aligned, because it's, again, it's a commitment. It's something that everyone needs to be familiarized with and agreed on. So it's the common language that we're talking about in regards to the increment. So the definition of done should be aligned either on the organizational level, when the organization dictates to everyone, okay, this is the minimum definition of done that you all need to follow, and each team can add more to it, or at least it's a definition of done that is defined for the teams, for the Scrum teams that are working on the same product. And the definition of done, it needs to be confirmed by the developers. It cannot be something that the developers say, oh, guys, we cannot do that. So it needs to be confirmed by them. Another change that we see in the new Scrum guide is regarding to the sprint planning event. Until now, we had 2 things that we considered when we did the sprint planning. We talked about what we're going to do in the sprint, and we talked about how we're going to do the work. Now the new Scrum guide, it brings another question that we need to ask. The question is why? Why is this sprint valuable? What is the value that it will bring? And this is the first question that we need to come and ask ourselves when we're coming to the sprint planning event. When we answer the question why the sprint is valuable, then we'll know what our sprint goal is. And then we continue to the next question of what can we do in the sprint in order to fulfill the sprint goal? And that will give us a list of product backlog items. And the third question is how. how will the chosen work, this list of product backlog items, how the work is going to get done. And that will give us a plan for the increments. And together, all those three things are our sprint backlog. And if we look at this, the most important thing among all three of them is the sprint goal. This is the one thing that will not change during the sprint, should not change during the sprint, because this is the value that we bring. This is what will take us one step closer into meeting our product goal. Okay, and during the sprint, the list of product backlog items, that may change because we learned something new, because we learned that we don't want to do this and we want to do that. But and also the plan for the increments, that may change. We thought we will have 3 increments and now we say we'll have 2. That is fine. But as long as we are still keeping and meeting our sprint goal, then we are on the right track. So this is super important to start the sprint planning event with asking ourselves why we want to do this sprint, what is the value that we'll get from it. Now, we have a few more changes and additions in the Scrum guide, and I will briefly go over them. The first one is that it's even less prescriptive than before. Actually, the Scrum guide was now shrunken by 31%, from 19 pages to 13. So it's a lot. And the change came because the guide now is much less prescriptive than it was before. Before, it included all sorts of methods and techniques on how to do things. Now it's giving much more freedom to the teams to decide how to implement Scrum in their teams, as long as they are keeping the principles of Scrum. So it's focusing now on principles. So you can see that things are removed, like the 3 daily Scrum questions. It's not mentioned there anymore. You can do your daily as you like, as long as you're doing it in order to understand and what is the plan for the next day. That is the principle behind this daily event. A lot of other things are removed also. Another thing that we see is the change of terminology and language. Now the language of the guide is talking to wider audience. It's no longer just speaking to software development industry people. So all sorts of terms like requirements and testing and design, they are removed. The word estimate is removed. You can see sometimes sizing for product backlog items, but not estimate. And of course, the change from development team into developers that I mentioned before. Another change that we see is a change in term that was very much familiarized and connected to the Scrum teams. It was self-organized. Now, up until now, the dev team, as part of the Scrum team, was described as self-organized. From now on, we're not talking about self-organization, we're talking about self-management of the Scrum team. And that is actually what the Scrum always intended, that the Scrum team will be self-managed. And that means that the Scrum team decides what is the work that it's going to do, how it's going to do this work, and who is going to do it. So it gives much more autonomy to the Scrum team. And this autonomy is very important. If I'm referring to Dan Pink's book, Drive, I'm talking about drive and motivation of knowledge workers. And know that autonomy, it's very, very important. If you have autonomy, then your people will be highly motivated. And from highly motivated people, they are more involved, and the very important to give this autonomy, this control to the Scrum teams. The other change that we see in the guide is mentioning of the term lean, together with empiricism that always existed. So this comes into pointing out that we want to have waste reduction and we want to have focus in our process. Those are things that are coming from lean. And like I mentioned in the poster of the new guide, the sprint now can produce several increments, not only one. After the sprint review, we can have several increments along the sprint. This is another important change. So what we learned so far about the changes? Well, we talked about the fact that Scrum is based on empiricism, the three pillars of transparency, inspection, and adaptation, and that the transparency is established by the three commitments: the product goal, which is a new term introduced in the guide, the sprint goal, and the definition of done. Now, we have only one team in Scrum. We have just the Scrum team. There are no sub-team within the Scrum team. One team, Scrum Master, Product Owner, and developers. The sprint planning event addresses three topics: why, what, and how, and together defines how the sprint should be. The result of those questions is the sprint backlog. The Scrum team should have autonomy to manage their day-to-day. This increases the motivation and the performance of the team. And the guide is much less prescriptive and gives freedom to decide how to implement Scrum within the teams, what to choose, what techniques, what methods to implement, as long as the principles of Scrum are kept.
So Dana, we are running out of time. And so first of all, thank you for the amazing session. We have a couple of questions, but we don't have enough time. So I suggest to take these questions into the Zoom room. Okay? So Marina.
I can see that I see here two questions that I can answer. You want?
So you have 1 minute.
I see here two questions I can answer quickly, or we can go to the.
Yeah. So
okay. The first question from Marina is
for quick answers. Go ahead.
Okay. About the sprint goal, we can have only one sprint goal, not several sprint goals. Okay. It's one that should be unifying everything that you want to accomplish, one value of the sprint that you bring. And also creates the cards, the users, the product backlog items. That's the decision of the Scrum team. Like I said, there is one accountable for the product backlog, that is the product owner, but the responsibility of creating user stories that can be shared, that is the decision of the Scrum team. The Scrum guide no longer dictates anything. That is the freedom that now it gives. The rest of the questions I can answer in the separate Zoom.